There's two ways to conquer and enslave a country. One is by the sword, and the other is by debt. Tajikistan, 2016. China built a 400-megawatt power plant for Tajikistan that cost around $350 million. The CCP funded the whole project and agreed to a repayment plan on the loan. Just 3 years later, when Tajikistan failed to make payments, China took over the country's gold mines as payback. Then, as Tajikistan missed payments on more loans, China took over its silver mines. Everything valuable in Tajikistan was now controlled by China. Sri Lanka, over $12 billion in debt from China. When the country was unable to pay its loans, the government took over a strategic port for business purposes. Once the country was officially forced into bankruptcy, China tried stationing military ships in Sri Lanka's port. These are China's latest generation space tracking ships, used to monitor satellites, rocket, and intercontinental ballistic missile launches. Plans were eventually pushed back when India caught wind of this news, asked Sri Lanka to deny the CCP permission to set up a military base so close to the Indian border. Pakistan, one of the biggest beneficiaries of Chinese loans, receiving more than $26 billion from the CCP and Chinese state banks, is now on the brink of bankruptcy. Money from China went towards building various infrastructure, including 12 power plants. Now, as the country struggles, these power plants have been shut down unless Pakistan makes an upfront payment on its loan. All these stories and more were all part of China's plan to increase its influence and power in the world. China wanted to overthrow the USA and become the superpower that every country listened to. And it was all going according to the plan. They were giving out loans under the disguise of help, and in return, they were getting all the important resources they needed. But then, something happened. Something that is now threatening the CCP's entire existence, and the CCP's plan to take over the world is crumbling right in front of them. But for us to understand why all of this is falling down like a house of cards, we have to first go back and understand quickly how China's initial plan worked.
The Maldives,
Sri Lanka,
Tajikistan,
Kenya's low.
Ethiopia.
Bangladesh, Pakistan is debt trapped by China.
China will go where it sees its opportunities.
For its part, China will own a little less than half the land.
They are losing the market for their products to Chinese imports.
And is suffering because of Chinese loans.
Now, let's back up a little bit to 2013. China was one of the fastest growing countries in the world, and at this point, it was becoming bigger than just a factory for the world's manufacturing. It was a powerful and rich country. But the future was bleak. Growth was slowing down, the young population that fueled China's past growth was getting old, and the CCP's one-child policy had put a huge dent in China's future population. That didn't deter the communist government from focusing outwards and growing its power around the world. So Xi Jinping launched the most ambitious project in history to increase China's influence around the world. China would give out loans to poor, struggling nations in the name of help, but in return, China gained control over countries with valuable resources or strategic locations. Now you may ask, well, what if these poor countries can't pay back the loans? Well, China would then get control over important resources like gold, silver, and oil. But, okay, now I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll get back into this more in just a second. Let's get back to the story. Initially, the project was called One Belt and One Road Project. But some countries wondered why it was named One Belt and One Road. Is it because China would be the only one in control? So to avoid any misunderstandings, the CCP changed the name to the Belt and Road Initiative. And the plan begun.
The Belt and Road Initiative.
The Belton Road Initiative.
The Belt and Road Initiative.
So the Belt and Road Initiative is this trillion-dollar project that China has started to connect itself
Through Southeast Asia, Africa, and all the way to Europe.
China has started loaning out billions of dollars to countries all around the world. It's given $12 billion to Sri Lanka, $26 billion to Pakistan, and $3 billion to Tajikistan. In total, it has given close to $1 trillion to more than 100 countries, most of them poor and struggling. So, when these countries default, China is able to get access to valuable resources and spread its influence. It controls power plants and strategic ports in Pakistan, gold and silver mines in Tajikistan, and quite famous Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, which it's trying to use as a military base as of last week. We will talk more about this soon, but first you guys might be wondering, why would these countries accept loans if they know China's true intentions? Well, unlike what Dave Ramsey says, loans aren't necessarily a bad thing. Now, things get wildly complicated when you look at the whole economy, so for simplicity purposes, I'll use a very simple example for the explanation. Let's say you are the head of a car rental company, which has 3 cars. Right now, you're making $1,500 in profit per month renting out cars. Now, let's say someone comes to you and offers you some loan money so that you can buy a 4th car, which you can use to make another $500 in profits. Now, as long as you use the loan money to buy a car like a Toyota, whose monthly payment is less than $500, then this is a pretty profitable business move for you, as the car will be making you more than what the loan payment is. Now, let's say you buy a car like a Mercedes, which has a monthly payment of, well, more than $500. Even though the car looks good for the business, it's not really a good business move, because now you are actually worse off compared to before you took out the loan. You would actually be making less profit, since now you have to use the profits from the other cars to pay off the loan for the Mercedes. Now, a country's economy is a lot more complex than the example I just gave, but the basics are still pretty similar. For any project that's built using the loan, as long as the output in GDP is higher than the cost of the loan, the country would consider that loan a good deal. But if the project from the loan doesn't turn out productive, then it's extremely bad news for these developing countries, as it pushes their economy even further back. And if China is involved, well, that just makes things even worse, as you will learn soon. Now, this is why when the world banks give out loans to poor countries, they come with contingencies. They have to show where the money is going, how it's being used, and if it even makes sense to use that money at all on certain projects. This helps eliminate or limit corruption and malinvestments from these loans. This is why Hambantota Port in Sri Lanka was denied the construction by several other lenders, because investments just didn't make sense from an economical standpoint. Sri Lanka already had a thriving port in the capital of Colombo, and even though demand was growing, it was nowhere close to a point where it would make sense to sink so much money into a new port. China, on the other hand, they didn't really care about the feasibility of the port when it loaned the money to Sri Lanka. In fact, it didn't really care about how the money was used in most countries, and it was all by design. Because you see, China's goal with these loans is not to increase the economic output of the developing nations. No. Its main goal was to gain influence over its politicians. Politicians who have decision-making power in the country, politicians who could sway public opinion in favor of China, and politicians who could push China's agenda on the international stage. China would just give loans with no oversight so that politicians can use the funds to win political points and stay in power. That's exactly what happened with Hambantota Port, as it was built in then-President Rajapaksa's hometown just to win political points with the public. Eventually, the Rajapaksa family's corruption led Sri Lanka's thriving economy to bankruptcy, and the family fled the country to avoid charges. But as long as politicians are cozying up to China, the CCP doesn't care how the loans are used. I'm sure China's communist government prefers that these corrupt politicians stay in power by any means necessary. When China took over the Hambantota port, a lot of experts gave them the benefit of the doubt and explained that this was purely a business deal to recoup the loan money, and China has no plans to turn it into a military naval base. But according to a news report from just last week, as soon as Sri Lanka goes bankrupt, China tries stationing a military ship in the port, and that plan was only delayed because India showed strong protest against China setting up a military base in their backyard. China has constantly encroached on India's northern borders, And India has no plans on giving in to China's aggressive behavior, but that's a story for a different video.
China is the bank, Africa is the customer, and Foreign Minister Wang Yi is the caller.
The Chinese government is backing large-scale projects across Africa.
It is fraught with political instability.
China has financed large infrastructure projects throughout Africa
As part of its so-called Belt and Road Initiative.
Basically, the perfect chaos for China to exploit.
The CCP has used the same tactics with countries in Africa to gain influence over politicians there. This is how China was able to set up a military base in this small but important country, Djibouti. Djibouti controls the access between the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, one of the busiest maritime trade routes, and now China has a military base there, and a controlling stake in the port that sits right on the choke point. China has also built the headquarters of the African Union in Ethiopia, but Chinese companies left something behind when they finished the projects. They had bugged the whole building and its servers. This way, the CCP always knew what African politicians were discussing and planning. And in this way, the CCP always had influence over Africa. Johnny Harris has a great video on this, and I will link that at the end. But you guys might be wondering why a Chinese company was building the headquarters for the African Union. Well, this is where we need to look at the terms of these loans that China was giving out. You see, these loans came with a lot of strings attached, and all of them were in favor of China. One of the most common terms in all these loans is that any project funded by these loans must be given to Chinese construction companies to build. So if the countries want to build a port, they hire a Chinese company. They want to build a power plant, they hire a Chinese company. And if they want to build a parliament, well, they hire Chinese companies. This is how the CCP was able to bug the African Union Parliament. But the problems don't end there. These Chinese companies mostly bring workers from China to work on these projects. Even food for these workers is imported from China. So at the end of the day, most of the money that China is giving out as a loan ends up finding its way back to China, while these developing countries are stuck holding the bills. Add on to that, a lot of these projects are becoming a non-productive part of their economy. There is the port and airport in Sri Lanka that no one is using. There's another port in Pakistan that's barely used for commercial purposes. And there are thousands of new apartment buildings in Angola that are sitting empty. This is just a few of the examples of malinvestment from Chinese loans that are all too common. The big reason behind this is that most of the time, there is no demand for these services, but since there's no oversight with these loans, they end up being built anyway. Because of this, these projects add little to no value to the economy, and the loans behind the projects actually take money away from the local budget in form of interest payments and debt repayment. This has turned into a horrible situation for a lot of these countries. If we remember our car example, because of these bad investments, countries are now stuck using their money for paying these loans instead of reinvesting in actual beneficial projects. Some of the repayment terms of these loans are also a bit, aggressive, to say the least. Usually World Bank loans come with an interest rate of 1 to 3% and a payback period of 30 years. But these Chinese loans come with an interest rate as high as 7% and payback period of only 15 years. Because of these, a lot of struggling countries were unable to make payments and defaulted on their loans. This is when China came up with a solution. It went to the struggling nation and said, hey, since you can't pay back the loan, would you be fine with us just taking over your resource mines and we'll forgive the loans? Or you can just lease the strategic port to us and we can extend the loan so you have more time to pay it back. Or in Angola's case, China got the country's oil when the country defaulted on the loans. It even went as far as to asking countries to stop recognizing Taiwan as a country and vote in favor of China's agenda during important United Nations votes. As the news of China's practices with the loans spread, the countries got more cautious about accepting Chinese help, and some countries went as far as to cancel all the projects they had agreed to. But that didn't stop the CCP. To avoid bad publicity and save face, the CCP has started requiring countries to not disclose any loan amount or loan terms to the public. And so oftentimes when a poor government takes on a loan from China, it's quite possible that the country's citizens might not even find out about it, let alone other nations. Because of its aggressive lending, China has become the biggest lender in the world, loaning out close to $1 trillion US. And this is where it made a big mistake. It was a bit too aggressive. Due to its aggressive terms, a lot of countries have started to default, and China was not expecting such a high rate so soon. COVID did play a big part in nations not being able to pay back these loans. Because of this, in the last 2 years, $52 billion in loans were at risk of default. That was more than 3 times the previous years. Oftentimes, China was also forced to loan out more money to keep some of these countries afloat so they don't default like Sri Lanka. Because, much like Sri Lanka, if a country defaults, the government is thrown out, and China would lose its influence over corrupt politicians, which it had bribed for so long. Now, every time I mention Sri Lanka, a lot of people point out that according to official figures, only 10% of Sri Lanka's debt was owed to China. Now, that number may not be correct. As I mentioned earlier, because of bad press, a lot of Chinese loans were lent out in secrecy. On top of that, a good portion of Sri Lanka's loans were owned by Chinese banks. And we have to remember that there's no such thing as a private company in China, and the CCP has a tremendous amount of influence over these banks. But we'll get back to the video now. In an attempt to keep its influence in struggling nations, China is being forced to give out rescue loans all around the globe. This situation is only getting worse as more countries face defaults because of the global recession, and they expect China to bail them out, as that's what they're doing with other countries. Speaking about global recession, I'm sure most of your portfolios are suffering too. Every time there's turmoil in the market, I try to remember Jim Simon's most important rule: remove all emotion while investing. That's what today's sponsor, Composer, helps investors with. They provide a new automated platform where you can build your own investing strategy called Symphonies. This way you take out all of the emotions and tell the automated system what your investing parameters are. The possibilities of the parameters you can set are quite literally endless. On top of all this, you can backtest any strategies you come up with. That way you know how useful it would have been. They also have a repository of templates created by their investment teams that you can use. If this is something that sounds exciting for you, then you can sign up for a free trial by clicking the link in the description.
A massive protest over frozen bank deposits.
Hundreds gathered in Zhengzhou. Tens of thousands of them have begun withholding payments.
In a notice circulating on social media, the suppliers have demanded payment from Evergrande.
As Evergrande's debt crisis deepens, small business owners and people waiting for homes to be completed are starting to despair.
As China clings to what it calls a dynamic zero-COVID strategy.
But the problem here is that China can't continue to bail out everyone because it's already struggling with problems at home. These issues are no joke for the Chinese economy. Real estate alone represents more than 30% of Chinese GDP, and the real estate bubble in China is 100 times worse than we had it in 2008. Mortgage boycotts can also lead to a liquidity crisis in Chinese banks, and if that happens, China's economy would be pushed back decades, as it is near impossible to operate a modern economy without the public's trust in the banking system. That's why, if these problems aren't dealt with carefully, it can crush decades of progress in the Chinese economy. 2022 is the first time in 30 years China will miss the CCP's GDP growth target, which was set at 5.5%. Because of all of these domestic issues, a lot of CCP officials aren't too happy with Xi Jinping loaning out bailouts to other countries. That's why if things don't improve for China domestically, these bailouts will stop. And if the global debt crisis continues much longer, many more countries will collapse, and China's plan to control the world will collapse with it. Alright, as cliche as this sounds, more than 94% of you guys aren't subscribed, which means YouTube may not recommend my future videos to you. So, if you enjoy the content, please hit that subscribe button, that way you can see all my future videos too.